automation means there is an automation process of release we do. So whenever we want to make a release for any of the application, what is that first we have to do? We have to mention the required checkpoints. Do you agree that? We have to mention the required checkpoints for the release. So if these required checkpoints were meeting exactly the work what we have completed so far, automatically release will be taken place. Otherwise release will be halted. Why? Because we are not completing the project at a time. This is not never happens, because in the beginning days, whenever we have started our careers and all, that time you could see. But nowadays, whatever the releases are we doing and all, everything is a continuous process, right? Releases and all, everything we are not doing for one time, right? Releases will be there in phase wise, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. This is how generally releases are being doing nowadays. So whenever we are planning releases and all, using different tools like something like Bamboo, all that, are you going to do this manual process? Are you following a manual process of release? Are we following the manual process of release or automation process? So if it is an automation, of release, what are the points to be taken care of? What points we take into consideration? Which points will be considered whenever we are going for release automation? If you want to automate the process of release, what are the points to be taken into consideration? Which points are we taking?
The release path, or the path for other repository like DLL and everything.
Okay.
Or any other dependency.
Checking out DLL files and all, everything you are doing for deployment, right?
Okay.
Because earlier what used to be is that deployment and release have two different phases in the beginning days. But nowadays you don't see any difference between these two. Whenever there is a deployment is happening, automatically we were moving on to the release this one, right? Because if everything is according to the expectation of the client environment and all, everything, and whenever the followed checkpoints, whatever the checkpoints we have mentioned, if these checkpoints were satisfied by the deployment procedure what we have done so far, automatically release, it will go to the release level. So earlier there is a release management plan which used to be done by the release managers and all, everything as separate. But nowadays you don't see any release management planning and all, everything as separate, because there are some required checkpoints will be mentioned. Whenever the deployment is completed, once we feel everything is right based upon the checkpoints what we have and all, everything, immediately we go for, immediately it will move on to the release phase, where that piece of work, whatever the amount of work I am going to tell you, so that piece of work will be released to the customer automatically. This is what generally release automation process is all about.
So what are the checkpoints, Raj?
Checkpoints is that first point. First checkpoint is that infrastructure. What is infrastructure? Because for example, I'm developing an application in my application. Okay.
Hello.
I am developing an application in my laptop. Now it was deployed well, it was executed, it is good. Now if I am going to deliver this to you, what is that we have to do? What we have to do? I want to deliver an application to you which was deployed successfully in my laptop. What is that I have to do if I want to deliver to you?
On my setup also the same machine should be there with the same configuration.
Infrastructure. This is what we call it as infrastructure, right? This is what we call it as infrastructure. Why are we taking infrastructure into consideration? Because there are points to be taken care of. First of all, sometimes there will be migration happens. For example, the application was in .NET. Now, whatever the application or whatever the solution you are going to develop is completely on Java. Okay. Now, customer is having an infrastructure which is something compatible to .NET. What is that we have to do? Because we have a regular setup. We have a setup which is something compatible to Java, because we are the people who are deploying it. But to whom it is required, we have to see whether the same infrastructure will be there at the client location or not. That we have to see. Point number one.
Mm-hmm.
Point number two, release management notes, we call it as. What is release management notes? There will be a documentation. It's not project documentation as separate, because project documentation, help. This is what we call it as help. Help will be there. Apart from the help, there is a release management notes we prepare. Release management notes will be there. In this release management notes, what normally we do is that whatever the release we are doing, whatever the phases of release are we doing, in which phase, what are the functionalities or what are the features are we going to deliver, that has to be prepared as a release management notes. This is also we have to see. Let's say, for example, there is an application called POS, right? So this POS application, you are not delivering a POS application at a time. What you are doing, you are planning this should be done in the 4-level phases. Now, whenever you are planning this in 4 different levels, in the first release, what features and what functionalities to be delivered? Will you make a notes or not for that? Will you prepare it or
Hmm.
not?
Right.
Will you prepare or not, right? So because for this release, what features, or I'm making it simple, right? What features and functionalities are we delivering? So that release management notes should also be prepared by the release train engineers. This is where nowadays there is a concept called release train engineer. You can see most of the nowadays their job opportunity is also more for release train engineers and all. These release train engineers' responsibility is to make sure whatever the infrastructure was accurate. Point number one. Second, there must be a proper release management notes has to be prepared. So in this release management notes, what are we going to release to the customer and all everything is what will be mentioned. Point number three. So in addition to the release management notes, what we have to do is to whom are we delivering is also important. To whom are we handovering? Who is the responsible person for a handovering of the release part is also something essentially important here. Fourth point,
Okay.
in reference to the releases and all that, are there any kind of regulatory standards and policies and procedures to be followed? Should also be taken into checkpoints. So there are 4 checkpoints. One is about the infrastructure you have to see. Second, release management notes. Third point, to whom we are submitting this. Fourth point is that whether whenever we are releasing the piece of work to the customer and all, to the client and all that. So what are the regulatory policies and procedures to be taken into an account? So that also should be taking into consideration. That is
Raj,
also comes under.
in the third point, like we mentioned to whom we are going to do the handover. So here we mentioned the client name, or is it like what?
Client representative, no, right? Client name, it's not
Client
client name,
representative.
client representative. See, for example,